talk to me about how you got to the point of being able to pull from so many different sources and yet objectively, and it is an objective account, and I appreciate that, objectively present what King was going through. I mean, I read this and I felt things for him and about him that I hadn't really felt before, even though he's a civil rights hero for me. So tell me about how you were able to do that.
Well, I wanted to portray him in human terms and in detail, and so that you would understand him not just as this paper icon, but as a human being, flesh and blood human being. So I tried in writing the book to connect with that side of his personality, that human side. And that's just what you do. I mean, it's narrative nonfiction, and that's what you do for a biography. And narrative nonfiction is you try to portray the person with as much understanding of who they are and what they were about as possible. So I appreciate your saying that, because that really was what I was aiming to do with the book. One reviewer was very kind to the book, a guy named Charles Blow for the New York Times, said that it demystified King. And I think that's what he was getting at, is that it was trying to get beyond this mythical image of him and show him as a human being. And at the same time, I hope I show him as an extraordinary human being with certain gifts that many of us don't have, and yet as a flesh and blood human being.
Well, I will tell you that in reading this, what I appreciated about the book is that he does, you do see him and you do get to feel his humanity through his stress, through his suffering, and even through his failures. And for me, as a believer in Christ who doesn't believe in venerating any man other than Jesus Christ, the work had an effect that I didn't expect it to have. As a result of reading it, I had a greater appreciation for what Dr. King did. And as you know, a big theme for the 50th anniversary around the country involves the title from his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? As a human being who is flawed, and maybe I should pridefully say that my flaws were not necessarily the same as his, but as a human being who's flawed, when I finished reading this work, I also had a greater appreciation for what God could do through any of us. But let me go to a most sensitive area where the work is concerned. You're not the first to speak to extramarital affairs in Dr. King's life. And the fact of those affairs has, for many people, meant that there is no reason to regard Dr. King. Okay? Given your work, your research, and again, I appreciate the objectivity here, how would you explain that?
Well, first, I didn't think I could ignore at least one of his extramarital affairs, because the book is a narrative, and the narrative span is 31 hours and 28 minutes to be precise. And he spends not an inconsiderable amount of that time with a woman who is a woman of standing, a civil rights leader herself, a Kentucky state senator. And she comes to Memphis and to lend moral support for Dr. King in that crisis, the crisis of Memphis. So she's there, and she's an eyewitness to history. I mean, I was really interested to hear from her. What was he like? What was he saying? What were his feelings at the time? And to ignore her completely would be to omit a significant element of the book and also not to hear from her and her impressions at that time. So that was one thing. As for the larger question of people who have a lower regard for him because he did have extramarital affairs, I think it's worth reading his sermon, his drum major sermon, where he talks about, he refers without naming anyone in particular and without spelling out exactly what he means. He talks about himself as a sinner like all people. And I suppose the question, and this is a matter really more for Christian theology than it is for a nonfiction narrative about Dr. King, but I suppose people should ask themselves whether they are flawed themselves and whether they are without sin themselves, and maybe they could look at King in whole and see everything that he did that was so remarkable and ask themselves whether this one shortcoming that he himself confessed to having and felt that was his own, if you will, failing in striving for perfect virtue, whether that's enough to disregard everything else that was so important about him. So I think that's the way to frame the question as I see it.
Well, speaking of the drum major sermon, you alluded to that in the book, and you talked about his, and this was not too long before he died, and you talked about his preaching concerning David, and as I read your presentation of his preaching that sermon, I felt his stress. I also felt his confession, even though he didn't go into detail about what was going on specifically with him. I felt the confession and the tone made me want to go back and listen to the sermon again. And as you pointed out, he even asked the congregation to not think of him as being sinless. I think the notion of people not understanding how he could be flawed was even creating more stress for him. I think this work really helps people to get a sense of how he was feeling at that time and how he was struggling with the fact that he wasn't perfect. I'm curious though, have you had any contact with his family in relation to the work?
I have not. I mean, the only contact I had, which was indirect, was I asked for a copyright license because I quoted liberally from his works, from his books and his sermons and his speeches. And in particular, in the chapter about the last speech that he delivered, which is the so-called mountaintop speech, in the original draft, I had large sections of verbatim quotes from that speech, and I wanted copyright permission. So he has the family, the King estate really, has representatives who field requests for a copyright license. And they asked to see a copy of the draft that I'd written, an early version of the manuscript. I sent it to them, and they declined permission. So then I had to paraphrase parts of the book in order to come within so-called, this gets kind of technical, but within the so-called fair use exception of the copyright law. And so that's as close as I got to the family. I really didn't have any reason to interview them because they were children in 1968, and they would have no recollection, from first-hand recollection of what happened in Memphis, which is the subject of my book. So the short answer is, and unfortunately, Coretta Scott King was dead by the time I started working on the book. I would have liked to have interviewed her, but that wasn't possible.